Hello again, everyone. Long overdue video here. Had a number of conversations with many of you about war and what happens if we go to war with North Korea. So war in markets has been in the news, and I thought I would address it for you here. We've seen some hot spots this year. Syria earlier in the year, which I think still remains pretty unstable, and then of course this guy in North Korea. And so I was just asked within the last hour in this office, what happens if we go to war with them? So it's best to just talk about it because 25 years ago, we used to be able to say to people, hey, turn off the news. And the only way you can turn off the news now is if you pretty much go out into the wilderness and live in a tent and leave your phone, because the news just finds us now, doesn't it? And a couple things about wars, though. There's some, as I mentioned, some hot spots, but it's always far more than we can even grasp. If you did a Google search as recently as May, there were 54 wars going on in the world. So there has never been a time that any of you have ever invested absent war. It's always going on. And there has never been a time of total world peace. The closest civilization has ever gotten to it would have been the Roman Empire. It would have been just before, during, and then some time after the time of Christ. It was a 200-year period. It was the closest mankind has ever gotten to a time absent war. And even then, there were still skirmishes where Rome would have to protect their borders, and that amounted to still a little bit more war. So in my opinion, and a lot smarter people than me, that was about the highest point of world peace we've ever had. So that in mind, as we look at this war, just bear that in mind. And then as we look at this, I think the best way to do it is to consider some data. And so I'm going to look at 5 wars with you, and we'll consider those. So here we go. Beginning with World War II. From the period of September 1939, before we entered the war, to 1945, 100,000 invested in the Standard & Poor's 500, grew to over $206,000, so we saw a doubling of money in 6 years there. There were other U.S. asset categories many of you own through my office here, or even significantly higher than that. Korean War. January of 50 to December of 53, we saw the S&P 500 in 3 years do just short of a doubling from 100,000 to 191,000. Vietnam, January of 1965 to December of 1973, the S&P 500 more than tripled from 100,000 to 321,000. At this point, I'm anticipating some of you might be as surprised as I have been at some of this data. The Gulf War, first war with Saddam Hussein, January of 1990 to December of 91, we saw 100,000 grow to 126,000, so double-digit returns there. And the finally, the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011, this was the second Iraq War, and the S&P 500 tripled from 100,000 to 326,000. What are we to take from this? Well, when we look at the data, we just don't see a correlation of sharp down markets associated with wars. The data is just not there. It's another thing that can add volatility. We can get volatility day to day from lots of things, and there's lots of things going on in the last couple of years that people were anticipating down volatility, and we've seen up markets instead. So what's the bigger thing we need to focus on here? The biggest thing is the 3 things I'm always coaching you on. These are the 3 big no-nos, and that is stock picking, timing the market, track record investing. All of those are no-nos. All of those add expense. All of those are destructive to investors. A conversation about war and markets becomes a conversation about timing the market. And so the biggest struggle for investors is not wars, but their own behavior. And I'll keep emphasizing this. If we ever were to return to that 200-year period of peace, like happened during the Roman Empire, I can assure you of this. In this day and age, our frenemies in the media would be presenting us other things to worry about. I can promise you that. So invest for the long term, and what these numbers tell us is that long term, even in the midst of war, markets still work. Stay disciplined, and thanks for tuning in.